All right, Proposition 3.
Okay, thank you. Good evening. So Proposition 3 is pretty straightforward. It is another bond. The proposition authorizes the state to sell $8.9 billion in new general obligation bonds for various water and environmental projects and programs. So I think we have a figure.
Yes. We don't have the figure. It looks
we
like
don't have a figure.
I apologize.
So there are kind of 6 broad categories. Water supply. I'll pull out my figure and talk from that instead.
I apologize.
That's okay. Okay, so watershed lands, there's $2.5 billion in that category, and that's to protect, restore, and improve the health of watershed lands, which is the area where water comes down from the mountains into rivers and streams. $2.1 billion in water supply, that's for projects like drinking water, wastewater treatment, water recycling, collection of rainwater. $1.4 billion for fish and wildlife habitat type projects to improve the habitats for fish and wildlife. $1.2 billion for water facility upgrades. That's for some specific projects, existing dams, canals, and reservoirs for specific projects in that category. $1.1 billion to clean up, recharge, and manage groundwater. And then $500 million for flood protection activities. So even within those broad 6 categories, however, there are about 100 specific categories in the proposition for how the funds need to be spent. So those are specific areas of the state, specific projects, or specific types of activities. Most of the funding would go out in grants to local government agencies or nonprofits administered by state agencies. Some of the funding is specifically identified for state departments and state agencies to do specific projects. For the fiscal effects, we estimate the cost to state taxpayers to repay the bond would be $17.3 billion over 40 years. That's the $8.9 billion in principal, as well as $8.4 billion in interest. So our estimates is that this would result in average costs of about $430 million per year from the state general fund for the next 40 years. For the fiscal effects on local governments, in general, we think this would probably result in some local savings, perhaps in the couple of $100 million a year. Because for many of these categories, we think some of this state bond funding would actually replace local funding for projects that local agencies would be doing anyway, particularly in some of those water supply type projects. So they'd be able to use state funding instead and therefore would save some local funding. And that's the broad outline of Proposition 3, pretty straightforward.
Thank you. So in terms of endorsements, we have opposition from the Libertarian Party and a few smaller scale Democratic and Green Party organizations. In support, we have conservation groups, water agencies, Water Conservancy, Ducks Unlimited, Pheasants Forever, that's cute, the Nature Conservancy, a bunch of water-related organizations, essentially. In opposition, the League of Women Voters and the Sierra Club. So there's sort of a split there. And then in support, we have members of the congressional delegation from California, gubernatorial candidates. It's somewhat bipartisan, which is rare, so we should celebrate anytime we have people from both sides of the aisle doing anything, I guess. And then in opposition, we have a few individuals who have expertise in water policy, and in terms of support for the press, it's split. And then the funding, this is another one with lopsided funding. Waterfowl Association, Ducks Unlimited, California Wildlife Association, pistachio growers, dairy farmers, organizations that are interested in water, that are in favor of it and spending money, and no money being spent on the other side. Questions about Prop 3?
This is coming up. Anyone who lives around the Delta wants to know, somewhere in here, is there some money set aside for projects related to the California water fix, or what some people call the twin tunnels?
No, and in fact, the initiative specifically says water should not be spent on projects related to Delta Conveyance.
Thank you for that question. Additional questions on Prop 3?
I don't know if you have any information on it, but it says that some environmental groups are against it. Is it they're worried about the effects of infrastructure, like creating new aqueduct, and they're worried about what that would do to the wildlife, or do they have any information on why they're against it?
Yeah, I think I would suggest reading some of the arguments against. I think the SAC-B also was against. They weren't on your list. There are a lot of specific arguments for and against. I think I'd rather have them speak to that than me.
Thank you.
Thanks.